Welcome to another installment of webinars that we are doing at 7 Insider. So for those who are joining for the first time, I'm gonna talk you through a little bit about what we are trying to achieve. So with the onset of pandemic, we moved all of our operations, well, those who could be moved online. And part of that is something that started as 7 Interactive and which now became 7 Insider. And it is basically a digital platform which spans across the whole 7 ecosystem. And it involves 7 Academy, it involves 7 Photo Agency and 7 Foundation. And as the idea was to somehow mitigate the isolations that we are all experiencing still, and to somehow fight our way through the noise of disinformation, partial information, fake news, and everything that really exploded together with COVID. And we remain committed to that. And as you may know, we have built a new website, which I urge you to check out. And we have a variety of events, such as book club, such as this webinar, various artist talks, and so on and so forth. So I urge everyone to check out our calendar, which is pretty populated already, and it's becoming bigger and bigger. And as you probably noticed, we have a lot of free content as well as premium content. So today, this is premium content. So thank you everyone for signing up for it and subscribing to it. And this time we have a very particular topic that doesn't leave anyone doesn't leave anyone not angry, so to speak. Today we are having a first session of 3-part webinar with our colleague Daniel Schwartz under the title While the Fires Burn, a Glacier Odyssey. And today it is a part 1. It's going to be 3-part webinar. We are recording it, obviously, so you will have also access to the recording. And the reason why we spread this in series of 3 is because it essentially is showing us not only the work produced over nearly 3 decades, but it shows this permanent commitment, Daniel's permanent commitment to environment and to all the changes that are happening. And just a few words about Daniel for those who don't know him. Daniel, I think, published like a dozen books. And other than being a brilliant photographer, he is also a well-respected editor. So I urge you to look out for his books. There's so many of them, mainly published by Thames Hudson. And I'm gonna mention this quote from his text. And he says, I'm gonna quote, I'm concerned with long perspective, far from being a reaction to events. I think that really sums up Daniel's approach to photography. Unlike most of the colleagues and most of the people you actually saw here speaking, Daniel doesn't really react to events like many of us do. And I think that's a really a distinction that we will talk further about it. But I think the reason why it's so important, another reason why it's so important for you to be here and to hear and see Daniel talking is that of all the topics and of all the subjects that journalism in general and photojournalism in particular covered, and among all the topics that journalism epically is failing is actually environment. Now that has changed a little bit. I may sound a little bit harsh. In recent, I would say 2 decades, that is slowly changing, where there is more and more journalists focused on what's happening and actually what we are doing to our environment. But if we look at the history of photography, it's really the topic that we as content creators really are failing miserably. So I think, and we're going to discuss the reasons for that as well. So I think it's, you know, so important to be here because of various reasons, including the fact that Daniel is dealing with something that is happening so slowly, but unfortunately is gaining speed, and our environment is degrading at alarming rate. And Daniel's been doing that and covering that for the past, well, for most of his life, if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, obviously, as usual, we are not, as usual, we can, and I urge you to ask questions, any questions in our Q&A box in Zoom. We are not streaming anymore to Facebook because we believe this is a more appropriate way to host our events. If for some reason Daniel doesn't get to answer the question you asked today, we will, however, answer those questions in the next webinar with Daniel, which is day after tomorrow. So Daniel, thank you very much. And I'm going to hand it over to you for time being. And in the meantime, people, there is a link to some of the Daniel's books in the chat room. So have a look at it. And Daniel, thank you very much for taking the time. And I hope everyone will enjoy your talk as much as I've been enjoying listening to you for the past almost 20 years. So Daniel, the floor is yours. I will kill my video for time being, but I'll be here. So, and I will jump in as much as possible. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you very much, Theo. Great pleasure. Hello, everybody out there, hopefully spread over 7 continents. I'm here in Switzerland. We just have a cold chill, but I think the year will be again a warm global warming year on record. Yeah, so my idea is that I would like you to relax because there's a lot coming. My idea is that I have prepared some texts because I want to be substantial when I take your time. So I'm going to read some of these texts which I've prepared, but will show you at the same time some images which hopefully interweave with what I'm going to say. I would like to, there's a point where it will be good to address the question which Theo mentioned, the long perspective. Will come in this presentation, we come to that point. What I would like to say is, maybe it's my character that I'm slow. I like to react to things which have a slow speed, but of course I also do react to things. It's only that these things happen sometimes in a very, very, very slow way. And at the same time, I should make really a point that my colleagues, like my 4 colleagues who were in the capital, they knew exactly what would happen. They knew how to be there. They got the picture which are needed. In a way, it's the same. It's just the speed is different. If I want to be in the right spot, and we'll come to that in the 3rd webinar, where do I go on the glacier to find things which had disappeared 80 years ago? It's in a way, it's the same. It needs preparation, it needs studies of things, it needs instinct. The same instinct is needed. The same instinct, basically, like my friends had when they knew something is going to happen at the capital. So this for the moment, as I'm going to read, because I want you to focus on the picture, not on the talking head, I'm going to sort of take off myself from the screen. And I'm going to read some of my text, and at the same time, I'm going to show you some work. My art is in the history of places, and by nature, documentary and informative. I'm concerned with the long perspective. Far from being a reaction to events, my work as a photojournalist is a commitment defined by observation that seek to localize and follow ecological and political developments and their social and cultural consequences over many years and over large geographical expanses. This statement, made in 2017, when reassessing my work, has a reassuring tone. So far, it has helped the public to find out my modus operandi and the raison d'etre of what I have wished to communicate over a period of 4 decades. It is a sense of the relationship between humans and the earth, received through direct observation and through the laboratory of the past. This human-environment relationship began about 11,500 years before presence in the Holocene, when a relatively stable climate permitted the innovation of agriculture. In this geological epoch, we currently still live at the beginning of the 21st century, officially, yet the planetary activities by modern societies and deregulated industries have become the potent cause of most recent and irreversible environmental changes. Earth, it is postulated, may have entered a new evidence-based, human-induced and human-dominated geological time unit, the epoch of the Anthropocene. Anthropocene or not, my mission remains the same, but 2 declarations of the earlier statement now ask for precision. Long perspective is to be replaced by geological timescale. Observations that seek to localize and follow ecological and political developments and their social and cultural consequences is to be replaced by observations of the reorganization of life on Earth and the transition to an Anthropocene society. Current human conditions were vulnerable long before, a year ago, the pandemic struck and exposed the weakness of a globalized world. The same human activities that drive climate change and biodiversity loss also drive pandemic risk through their impacts on our environment. Changes in the way we use land, the expansion and intensification of agriculture, and unsustainable trade, production and consumption disrupt nature and increase contact between wildlife, livestock, pathogens and people. The health crisis is irresolvable link to the climate crisis, and the latter had been studied as a multiplier of existential risk for many years. Yet, at present, the human species has no concept of an Anthropocene society. Security and ecosystem will remain interconnected, and so will biosphere and body. What will being human mean? What culture? You remember, it comes from Latin cultura, the tilling of land and the act of preparing for crops agriculture. Rethinking the human-environment relationship requires an understanding of human history with the Earth system. History, the knowledge of which helps to read and navigate the present, is a leitmotif of my work, alongside with environment and climate. 2 of my books especially share this context, and in many ways they are counterparts. Delta, the Perils, Profits and Politics of Water in South and Southeast Asia, published 1995, and Wildfires Burn, the Glacier Odyssey, published 2017. Delta was an early photojournalistic investigation of the climate crisis. Emphasis was the conditions humaines in some of the habitats designated in the first assessment reports by the World Climate Programme and the IPCC in 1987 and 1990 as endangered by rising sea levels due to melting polar ice as a consequence of global warming, the deltaic regions of Asia. Back then, in the densely populated estuarine deltas of Ganges, Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy and Mekong, the loss of land due to overuse, erosion and sinking could already be observed. 30 years later, in 2019, a study by Climate Central corrected earlier biases in coastal digital elevation models based on Endeavour Orbiter data. LiDAR improved elevation data used in tandem with latest population statistics and forecasts for sea level rise found that even with moderate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, 6 Asian countries where 237 million people live today could face annual high tide coastal flooding threats by 2050. That is roughly 183 million more than assessment based on prevailing elevation data. In Bangladesh, the new estimate versus the old estimate is 42 millions versus 5 millions. In Vietnam, it is 31 million versus 9 million. For the latter, this is more than 1/4 of the country's population, or the 20 million who today live on land that in 30 years is expected to be inundated, land that includes the entire Mekong Delta. In Switzerland, terrain does not disappear, but is emerging at the price of retreating and vanishing glaciers. Since the end of the Little Ice Age, around the mid-19th century, Swiss alpine glaciers lost about 60% of their mass, of which 37% since 1980. Deterioration is accelerating since 2011. The number of glaciers is increasing through fragmentation, which, as a consequence, adds to their exposure. By current melt rates, almost complete extinction is expected by the end of this century. Well before this future reality of green Alps by 2040, Swiss glaciers will have wasted down to a size making it impossible to fill man-made reservoirs in winter. Foreseeable, therefore, is the conflict between the agricultural sector, which wants to use river water for irrigation during spells of heat and drought, and the hydropower plants, which need to store the water to cover peak power demand in winter. Anthropogenic climate change, however, responsible for glacier shrinking due to warmer average temperatures, will also result in an increase in the frequency of intense precipitation events as a consequence of changing North Atlantic atmospheric circulation patterns. Rather than in the physical state of snowflakes, water will come increasingly liquid, potentially together with severe flooding. Meanwhile, its mountains will provide Switzerland with enough water for a population expected to reach 10 million in 2050. Until then, therefore, the country may be spared a water crisis, but synchronous with the future alpine terrain taking shape under the vanishing ice, an identity crisis is in the making. Between the Enlightenment era and the end of the Second World War, the alpine range was configured as an essential for the Swiss nation. First, its physicality was understood as shared and unifying natural feature, alloying a heterogeneous society which populated an ideal pastoral, yet also frightening landscape. Sorry. Against the backdrop of nationalism that arose beyond the borders, the mountains then were fortified as an impregnable redoubt aimed to deter a potential German invasion and deny access and use of passes and tunnels as transportation infrastructure, and were portrayed as a manifestation of Swiss national character. But will green Alps and dark peaks still qualify as a national symbol? If such was the Swiss background against which I embarked on the project Wildfires Burn, a Glacier Odyssey, charging mountain landscapes with patriotic and heroic meaning, however, is far from being a historic feat and limited to my homeland. Melting glaciers can shift boundaries between adjacent watersheds that follow mountain ranges, and thus can lead to disputes over high altitude border territories because regional politics must secure access to resources. Over the past 80 years, dropping of the glaciated terrain of the Chodul Plateau has moved the border further into Italy and increased Swiss territory, which now encompasses parts of the neighboring Italian ski resort. A joint commission is trying to solve the affair. Another matter is the impact of continuing militarized tension on the Himalaya environment and its people. Since 1984, Indian, Pakistani and Chinese troops are locked in a costly, silent and deadly standoff in sub-zero temperatures at the Ziyah Glacier, where disputed territories meet the line of control, itself a legacy of an earlier war. Here, the resource is water. Control over the catchment area is critical. Ziyah, like most glaciers of the Great Arc stretching from the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan to the easternmost fringes of the Himalaya and intersecting with the Pamirs, the Karakoram and Tian Shan are out of equilibrium, meaning ablation exceeds accumulation, and thus the glaciers have a negative mass balance. All glaciers of the watershed separating the inner Asian plateau and the subcontinent are shrinking, putting at risk the future of the South and Southeast Asia region, watered by Brahmaputra, Ganges, and Indus, and the numerous tributaries. Today, 129 million people are substantially dependent on upstream meltwater for their livelihood, in addition to 48 million people that inhabit the catchment areas and who directly depend on local glacier and snowmelt. Pakistan is already a water-deficient nation. Wars over water are looming in Afghanistan. There, fighting increasingly takes place outside the traditional season, a sign that factors driven by climate change might have contributed to the precarious security situation in the drought-prone Hindu Kush, where glaciers are a source of the water needed for critical late-season crop irrigation. Glaciers, therefore, their retreat and fluctuations are not without implications for the rebuilding effort and, most notably, food security. So glaciers have indirectly become a variable of the current course of war. And since war never cares about the needs of the environment, it contributes to its destruction. Paragraph 13.1 of the Agenda 21, which summarized the 1992 Rio de Janeiro UN Conference on Environment and Development, also known as Earth Summit, states, quote, "Mountains are an important source of water, energy, and biological diversity. Furthermore, they are a source of such key resources as minerals, forest, and agricultural products and recreation. As a major ecosystem representing the complex and interrelated ecology of our planet, mountain environments are essential to the survival of the global ecosystem. Mountain ecosystems are, however, rapidly changing. They are susceptible to accelerated soil erosion, landslides, and rapid loss of habitat and genetic diversity. On the human side, There is widespread poverty among mountain inhabitants and loss of indigenous knowledge. As a result, most global mountain areas are experiencing environment degradation. Hence, the proper management of mountain resources and socio-economic development of the people deserve immediate action. That was written in 1992. Agenda 21 had aimed at, quote, preparing the world for the challenges of the next century. Eventually, however, by introducing the concept of sustainable development and sustainable growth, it provided a legitimation for further unabated rapacious plunder and delayed for a few more decades the day of immediate action. In April 2007, 30 years after publication of the book Delta, the UN Security Council opened its first meeting on global climate change as a threat to international political stability. Sub-Saharan Africa, small island states, and the major river deltas of Asia were declared the most vulnerable areas. The call to act came late. Squandered had been the momentum to tackle together the intertwined issues of green and peace. Global warming had become politicized. Consequences of the climate crisis played into the political crisis, which since 2011 engulfed the Near East in wars, which in turn have created the largest exodus in human history. In the book Delta, documented are people's attitudes to the natural world, and especially to the rivers, which are mythological entities inhabited by gods and spirits and an object of religious worship, whose cycles relegate their lives and the migratory patterns of fish, but which are increasingly being dammed as a source of energy to generate export revenues. Back then, my overriding themes were human resilience in the face of floods, the aftermath of cyclones, and the silent emergence of soil and riverbank and coastal erosion in Bangladesh, in the daily confrontations with the legacies of war in Cambodia, in the challenges posed by the transition economy in Vietnam, and under the iron fist of an oppressive military regime in Burma, which propels us fast forward to the dramatic events unfolding right now in the country also known as Myanmar. In the case of Vietnam, the project's documentary scope, however, overlapped with a biographical connection. Literally inscribed in the Mekong Delta are lines of my family history, lines which I followed when working on the Delta project, thus interweaving work and parentage. Lines which brought me back to the birthplace of both my Vietnamese grandmother and my mother. The collective history of the region that provides the setting is imbued with failed ambitions, betrayed hopes, and crimes against humanity and the environment. As a historic document, the carte physique et politique de la Cochinchine d'après les documents officiels de la colonie, issued in 1996, we saw a part before, is a link to my parentage. Framed, it now hangs on the wall of my darkroom. Below the frame is a bookcase that has become the repository of literature on climate history, environment, and resources wars. For the map relates to them, to exploitation and oppression. For my grandfather, the map spoke of the ingenious challenges as he worked as independent general contractor to the French colonial administrators. Between 1917 and 1929, he built canals, water gates, bridges, and other infrastructure of the réseau hydraulique in the Trans-Basak region of the Mekong Delta, more precisely in the malaria-infested Kamau Peninsula. Such was his contribution to the advancement of the mission civilisatrice into the most outlying regions of Cochinchine, in the specific environment of the Delta. This mission, portrayed as an example of French Revolution ideas about labor reform put in practice, depended on movement on water, mechanized dredging, and corvée labor. The battle in the Mekong Delta was against siltation and to secure the constant movement of water between coastal and hinterland river zones in the face of seasonal flooding and the varying tidal pulses of both the Gulf of Siam and the South China Sea. These pulses reach up 100 kilometers upstream and are responsible for the delta's extremely flat, ever-changing landscape. At the time of my grandfather's activities, this subjection of the environment, combined with the influx of 30,000 settlers annually, had brought more than 2.5 million hectares under riziculture and plantations, as opposed to 350,000 hectares in 1879. With peasant mobilization against French rule and activities by proto-communist groups foreshadowing the First Indochina War, living and working conditions became increasingly unstable for the administrators and those who worked for them. In the 1960s, during the American War in Vietnam, the remaining wetlands and the mangrove forests of the Kamau Peninsula, which my grandfather had helped to make profitable for the French, provided the sanctuaries for the Viet Cong. As a consequence, the mangrove belts, a natural buffer against tidal waves, were sprayed with the so-called Agent Orange to deny the enemy, the Viet Cong, its natural shelter. In the process, the entire region became the site of an ecocide. The frequently impenetrable quagmire, which offered to the enemy cover and access by land and or water to American bases in the first case, was to be defoliated in order to improve observation, penetration, and movement of the friendly Arvin group forces and to destruct enemy crops. Consequently, tactical herbicides were introduced both in major defensive and offensive combat roles in the arsenal of modern warfare. From March 65 to January 71, Operation Ranch Hand consumed and disseminated a total of 19 million gallons of herbicides coded blue, green, orange, pink, purple, and white. Of this total, 11 million gallons was what became to be known as Agent Orange, formulated to contain a 50-50 mixture of the two phenoxy herbicides 2.4-D and 2.45-T. Associated with dioxin, Agent Orange became the most widely used herbicide of choice. Approximately 85% of Agent Orange was applied to forest defoliation, and it proved to have persistent effect in defoliating the mangrove forests of Kamau. Over the years, however, it became apparent that spraying was a futile attempt to deny concealment and food supplies to the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, the Viet Cong. Decomposed leaves created abundant food, and the masters of camouflage found fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and other aquatic resources in increased quantities. Such was one of the ways dioxin, a highly toxic and persistent organic pollutant linked to cancers, diabetes, birth defects, and other disabilities, entered the food chain and costs life to this day. In 1993, as reforestation of the mangrove belt began, I visited Bac Lieu, where in 1901 my Vietnamese grandmother and in 1921 my mother were born, and looked for vestiges of my biographic past. Since then, I've returned many times, documenting the deltas as one of the fastest growing regions during the transition of the country's economy from plant to market. In 2011, 110 years after my grandmother's birth, and according to her last wish, I finally was able to bring her ashes from Switzerland to Buccleuch, the oldest pagoda in town and an orphanage since its foundation in the late 19th century, became her final resting place. As the delta keeps sinking, due to unsustainable growth in the region and beyond, as well as due to the new booming business of sand export, her ashes may well be washed into the South China Sea one day. This Ferrari, of course, is not mine, but I'm looking down on this wonderful car, as every Italian would say, from the room of the Continental Hotel, which presumably at one of his stays my grandfather also had used, and which is the room where Graham Greene wrote the famous Quiet American. So the place is the Liberation Square. So global affairs, political affairs take surprising turns. In 1992, I managed to deceive Burma's military regime and push to the southernmost tip of the delta to Pagoda Point, located at Cap Mountain Sun. Back then, SLOC, the State Law and Order Restoration Council, had assigned the Navy to protect the 150,000 square mile economic zone in the Andaman Sea, where French and American firms were developing gas fields. For its help to keep the regime in power, China was allowed to turn the small fishing port near Cap Kamau into a gateway to the Indian Ocean. Almost 30 years later, a visit to the delta in 2019 showed the decline of river traffic and the construction of bridges, the exploitation of sand, and the abandonment of rice mills. Throughout history, in the Burma Delta, rice and rulers had been closely connected. Before the British conquest of the kingdom in 1852, the Irrawaddy Delta had been a chief granary. The balance of trade of colonial Burma did not experience a single year of deficit from 1886 to 1940. Continual trade surplus of rice and other export products throughout that period reflected the natural strength and the relative richness of the Burmese economy. When the army, known as the Tatmadaw, toppled a democratically elected government in 1962, the country was the richest in South and Southeast Asia. 50 years later, it was one of the poorest. In 2008, the regime's woeful response to Cyclone Nargis, which killed 140,000 people, destroyed any vestiges of credibility it might still have had. This February 1st, 2021, the Tatmadaw's thirst for power shut down the precarious, fledgling democratic rule which it had allowed in 2011 to emerge from diplomatic isolation and China's orbit. So far, the coup has led to widespread civilian disobedience and been almost bloodless, but this could change any moment. The Bengal estuarine delta is thought to have been formed on the reversal of the Indo-Brahma River in the late Pliocene period, 7 to 25 million years ago. It is an immature delta of almost 5,000 square kilometers. The waters flowing into Bangladesh, with the Ganges in the west, the Brahmaputra in the north, and the Soma in the east, drain a basin extending over 1.5 million square kilometers, covering 5 countries on both sides of the Himalaya. Bangladesh is like a funnel through which these bodies of water push to the sea. It is basically land upon water. The living space of millions of people settled by the banks and on chars, the alluvial temporary islands in the river, is continually under threat from the silent or insidious disaster of erosion. As the waters of the rivers break into the sea, They are met by the currents from the Bay of Bengal, which undermine the basis of islands and cause them to emerge and disappear at the same time.
So this is like the most damning piece of writing when it comes to capitalism. So you spoke like a true socialist, I would say. But may I just add to the chat room here a text that it's an excerpt from a book called The Coming Anarchy. And it's, I'm sure you read The Coming Anarchy, right? By Robert Kaplan. And it's somewhere in that book, which I urge everyone to have a look at least at this article, but he says something along the lines, we can forget all the barbarities that people are doing to each other in wars and so on. We can forget all that because that's nothing in comparison what we're going to do to each other once the nature turns against us, so to speak, although that's not it's a poor choice of words. And I think this is what you showed here is actually like a prelude for me. I mean, this is like the most depressing thing I've heard in a very long time. I've known many of these facts, but once you see them all in one place, it's, I mean, it's a very ominous, it's a prelude to a complete disaster. I mean, wars that are currently fought are nothing once, you know, half of the population or 2/3 of Bangladesh is underwater, when Pakistan is out of water and so on. I mean, it's horrible what's coming to us. I mean, it's beyond me that we are capable of doing that. Can I just go back quickly to the title of your first book on Delta? Let me just find the first, yeah, so Delta, the Perils, Profits and Politics of Water in South and Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, we can replace South and Southeast Asia with any country or with any part of the planet, right? Or if not now, in 10 years' time, definitely we can, you know, put Europe instead of Southeast Asia or America and so on. So, I mean, this title, Perils, Profits and Politics, I mean, clearly, I mean, I think we are not wrong if we say that liberal capitalism is to blame. But then on the other hand, we have all the samples from Soviet Union with Baikal Sea, right? Sorry, with the Aral Sea, where irrigation of the rivers that bring water to Aral Sea because of the cotton production and so on and so forth basically destroyed the entire lake. So it's not something entirely unique to capitalism. However, these days, most of the world of the planet is capitalist. So I would say allowing liberal, uncontrolled capitalism to take over, we really signed our own, death sentence. Is that too much to say?
I would replace capitalism with consumerism.
Yeah, one doesn't go without the other.
Consumerism, because capitalism, I mean, if today you want to exit fossil energy, you need a cooperation with the fossil industries because they know the problems that entails. Once you open an oil well, it's not so easy to close it again. Basically, you can't close it again. So these industries, they have the capital, the expertise, and they really know the problem. If Greta says, we have to stop it immediately, then of course it's a youngster's right and is inspiring for other youngsters. But in the short term, it would cause more victims than it would cause if we slowly So I really think the problem is consumerism. I mean, nature and the environment doesn't need us. We need the environment. And of course, it's part of our problematic, rather suicidal path of progress, I would say, problematic path of progress, we were trial and error, and we made terrible errors on both sides of the Iron Curtains. Every system made terrible, but also we have managed to, to abolish plagues and all the things. I mean, the free market never has been a pandemic, sort of a vaccine developed so fast for a pandemic like now in the case of Corona. And that's due to the globalized science exchange, to capital getting into the, it's not that easy, but I think really consumerism is the problem, and consumerism confronts every individual with his own behavior. Do I really need, a $1 t-shirt every 2 weeks? Do I need 20 pair of running shoes, etc., etc.? It's really there. There's enough stuff here to be shared. The problem is distribution. It's like if you engage Coca-Cola, malaria, mosquito nets can be delivered to every village in the African continent where it's needed. If we employ supranational organizations, things become bureaucratic and things become very complicated. So I think, that's why also all these are sort of, not. When people talk war against poverty, war against the pandemics, this is the wrong approach, But consumerism has the beauty that everybody is confronted in his daily actions with the problem.
So how did you, you just guided us through, 30 years of photography and several books. So I'm just curious, it's a very typical question for webinars like this, but I think it needs to be addressed. How do you maintain focus for 30 years? It must be, you mentioned and traveled and covered, dozens of countries to events or situations in dozens of countries. How do you maintain focus? It's such a, when they say big picture, this is really big picture. So how do you maintain focus over 30 years? How does that work? For you,
30 years it has become now with the 2 books. In between the 2 books was the one on Central Asia, which was similar wide in reach. It even went further down into history. It comprised all these wars in the arc of crisis, as I used to call them, between the Caspian and Kashmir, between the Hindu Kush and Xinjiang. My approach is I always start in the library and maps. I put the maps in my head, and I do read a lot of research. I read very old books and very new books and read them parallel. In the case of the deltas, in '88, when I started to look into this really, really early, when already the deniers of climate change were there, and those like Bill McKibben, I have showed you that book. I still think it's one of the most beautiful books. Bill McKibben, The End of Nature, published in 1991. It's a wonderful book. He said it already then. So what I did is, once I had decided to go to the deltas, I made sort of a flat plan. I'm a very analog person, so I'm not working digital, so I'm very analog. So I made a flat plan having the 5 countries, and then I had divided the 5 countries. I made plans. When does the monsoon flood come down from Nepal and India? When does it reach India? When does it pour into Bangladesh? When in these 5 countries is the rice harvest? When is the sowing season? When is the harvesting? When are the festivals, religious festivals? So basically I was looking at sort of the calendar of these countries, and I knew exactly when I had to be where, and ideally I was able to combine things. Of course, then unforeseen things happened, like a cyclone, or problems in Cambodia again. So once I had this framework, I was ready to react very quickly on things which popped up on short notice. So I never lost my sort of the big picture.
And the logistics of it, surely what you just described is the intellectual part of it. But what about what we like to call business side of it? You still had to, I mean, it's still a lot of turf to cover, a lot of tickets to pay, and it wasn't always a contract for Thames and Hudson, right? So
well, it was, you know, it was, I mean, the good thing is, and I have been, my privilege was to work always with his publisher, and sort of the subject of the book was defined before. So I always knew I would work towards a book. Eventually, one would derive an exhibition from it, but I was always working towards a book. Now, of course, with a book, you don't earn money. So the beauty of the arrangement was because I had this long perspective in my head, I was able to convince magazine editors, magazine publishers to commission me with reportages, because they sort of had the confidence that I knew what I was looking after. And when an editor would say, well, you should go there, and I imagine this story to come out like this, and I said, you have to go yourself. You know, if I go there, I have an idea, but on the ground things look different, and I have to adapt my idea. So I found out for this book, as well as for the one on Central Asia, Traveling Through the Eye of History, a lot of work I was able to realize as part of magazine assignments. And it was reassuring for the magazine publishers that I was working towards a book. Obviously, needless to say, not every picture which was in the magazine story made into the book, because there the book had another scope.
But those days are over, unfortunately.
Those days are over. However, you saw that one picture from Afghanistan with the glacier table, and the security people sitting on the glacier table for the first time. They had climbed up so high and seen a glacier table, and I trained them in marking glacier extents, because they had flash floods, and just 2 months before a glacier lake outburst and mudslide all of a sudden came down, and they didn't know where it came from. The whitebeards in the tea houses said it was Allah's will, but no. You know, if you go up there and see how these glaciers are behaving, and if you can monitor them, now Afghanistan has other problems than monitoring glaciers. But when I went to a publisher and say, look, we, the West, NATO and the Americans, we have been 20 years in this country. What did we achieve? The main thing has been overlooked. And then he said, what's the main thing? I said, it's water, it's water. And the water crisis hits a country which has been for 30 and 40 years at war. So if you have arguments, you still are able to find magazine publishers. I truly believe so. And I would encourage everyone, every young photographer in our audience, think a lot. If you have an idea, go and check it out, look at it from different side, discuss it with experts, and until you come to a thesis which is so striking that a magazine publisher said, why didn't I think about that?
So we have a question by Maciej. He's asking, excuse me, how has your work changed, I assume aesthetically, but not necessarily, since the environment became the center of attention? How has your work changed?
Thank you, Maciej. Technical question. Before I went to the deltas, I did this other complicated thing to reconstruct the Great Wall of China, and there I used 4 or 5-inch camera tripods because I thought it's a big topic, big subject, so I need a big camera, and it was sort of a 19th century adventure. So when I came after I survived that physically and mentally, and I was looking into the deltas, I said, okay, here now I'm confronting people, and I don't need a tripod, and I have to walk through the water and meet the people in the water and have somebody walking in front of me who would then disappear, and then I knew that I have to go around and make a curve. So so I basically, since the 1990s, I didn't touch a tripod anymore. I'm using my Hasselblad like a Leica. I use it shooting out of the car. There was one image before this billboard. So I've sort of trained myself to squeeze the maximum of the Hasselblad, which is still analog. You will see it in the third lecture and also in the film Day After Tomorrow. I'm shooting from the helicopter analog with changing magazines. I like slow speed also in my technical approach.
So why do we make books, Daniel? I mean, we live in this digital age, and I ask everyone that. I mean, I have my theory why I like books, but I'm just curious, like, I mean, books are not so, they're not handy, they're heavy, they're difficult to ship, super expensive to produce, very hard to distribute. Like, there's the list of cons is massive, right? And but yet we still do it, and you still do it. So I'm just curious, why do you do it? Why books? Why not other, of course, exhibitions and so on? But one of your trademarks is bookmaking. So I'm just curious, why do we make books? What's this inside motivation and motive to insist and keep making books?
Well, it's a question which probably has many answers. I've never found the single answers. There's a say that now this is again men have said that, certainly not of women. Women probably have a similar choice. There's a saying, I don't know where it was born, that men do three things. They plant a tree, they make a child, and they make a book. So basically, I think it has to do with every human's urge, when he doesn't walk around on this earth anymore, to leave something which continues. And I think that's sort of, if you do a book, of course it adds to your name, but at the end it's some pieces of paper stuck together, better or worse, but it gives you it's something in your hand which keeps you walking. And I tell this the students who attend our bookmaking workshops with Philip Blenkinsop and others, don't rush. If you working on a complicated subject, just give it time, let it grow. All of a sudden, things fall in place. And if you work towards a book, it's not something which sits in your neck. It sits there on the table, you put it away, you get frustrated, you take it back, you look at it at night, in the morning, in different times. It grows with you. It's something which matures. I always say a book, it's better to have a book 5 years too late than 1 month or 1 season too early. It's a wonderful question, and I think not to find the right answer, because the answer changes from situation to situation, is always a beautiful one.
And along those lines, we have a question. So the book, and I'm quoting, the books are a limited reach and have limited audience. Have you been involved in any educational or activist projects that called for action?
Yes, I had been, I always try to, or let's say the other way around. I always thought, if you are able to do something, do it, and don't teach it. It was only since I'm with 7 that I've become a tutor. And my students know that I'm brutally honest and straightforward, and this is great, because as long as you're honest and as long as you're transparent, the call for action, I've been asked to lend my name to a glacier initiative in Switzerland, Save the Glaciers. I will come back to that in the third lecture. I think this is the wrong approach. You cannot save glaciers because it's in the very nature of glaciers to disappear, to wax and wane, to come and go, according also how the planet is wobbling in space. So I rather try to act through my pictures and before, and that's why I'm so frustrated with these 30 years which have been lost until from the early 90s until 2007, when finally, and we know the reasons, they were political, the UN Security Council said, yes, global warming is a security risk. It took them 30 years, and these are the 30 years which are lost now. And it was known, and that was also sort of the part of thinking ahead, do a story which has a life after the publication. That's what I always tell the students, think about the afterlife of a work. And at some point, a lot of work which, a lot of reportages I did in 2000 and afterwards in Central Asia. Now it's historic images, the work from Bangladesh and Southeast Asia, it's historic images, but things go on. So it really helps you as a book also, which sort of keeps you going. It's something which is ahead, a direction where you can work towards, but it's not sort of pressing on your neck every day.
So at the beginning, I mentioned that I believe, and I think I'm correct, that journalism in general and photojournalism in particular is by now traditionally failing to properly, I wouldn't say address, but cover the climate change and the destruction of our environment. Now, admittedly, that's changing a little bit in recent years, but why is that? What's the reason? Why are we so bad at, we're so good at covering wars and so on, and news events and what have you, and sports and culture, but we are so bad at, with few exceptions, but we are so bad at covering what's probably the most important thing, and that's the planet that we're living on and the environment and the destruction of it. Why are we so bad at it?
Well, I think it also has, I would not say bad. I think it's also in the system. I think, when this topic of climate change, and now I should say climate crisis, came up 20, 30 years ago, it was not easy to convince magazine editors that this is a story to be done, because you could not see it. It's easier to take pictures of a war, seemingly easier. Don't misunderstand me. It has other risks and other challenges, but there is action going on. How do you show the silent disaster, which is not screaming? There was this picture with these, you only saw feet on a crumbling riverbank. This is no action. This is no action. It's simply a reproduction of a eroding riverbank and villagers standing there and looking how the land on which they live for a month or 2 months is crumbling away under their feet. You need to, if you're covering a subject which is not moving, you need to give thought. I had an interesting discussion with my mentee the other day. He was really, I drove him to desperation, but he likes that and he reacts very well. Swarat, I hope you're attending. We were talking about water and things, and I wanted to make him understand what is the essence of a glass. The essence of a glass, it's not the light, it's not the shadow, it's not what's inside, it's that it's void. How do you show void? Because the void is the essence, which is really the raison d'etre. The only existence for a cup, for a glass, is that it's void, that it can receive something. How do you photograph that?
And there's a question from Paul who says, along the same line, and I think we are out of time, so let's close it with this question and your answer. So therein lies the ultimate discussion: can photography alone portray climate change? Is it capable, sufficient?
I think photography has a wide range of possibilities and severe shortcomings. I think the best photography is always, and increasingly I find out this really, photography is wonderful in pairing up with science, whether that's geologists or meteorologists or atmospheric science. Photography can be applied everywhere as long as it remains visual. It has to be strong imagery. It has not to try to cover what, as an orbiter, a satellite, or a technical tool, a LiDAR scan can do. Photography has also to do with humans. It's always the human approach, and if that's combined with facts and figures, with cartography, and with all these things, then photography really can contribute. And what it contributes is the human, that the viewers are directly spoken to by the people we are looking at, and people who lend us their stories and their faces in our works.
Thanks, Daniel.
Compassion would be the word, right? Compassion.
That's the key word. There was another question which we will leave from the next time. So everyone, thank you very much. I just posted the link for the second session, which is day after tomorrow. So hopefully we will see you back. And Daniel, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Just before you leave, I'm going to ask this question, then we're going to answer it later. The question is obviously about what are you focusing on now? But let's leave that for our next session. Everyone, thanks again for tuning in. Stay safe. I hope you'll get vaccinated. I'm living in a country that doesn't have a plan for vaccination plan, so good luck with that. And everyone else, stay healthy, and we'll see you same time, day after tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Daniel.